So what happens when a pastor leaves a church? You might think it's just like any other job opening, but it's really not. It kicks off this incredible, super-structured journey for the entire community. It's what's called a sacred search, and we're going to break down exactly how it works.
All right, so the pastor resigns, the pulpit is empty. What happens next? I mean, who's in charge of finding the new person? It's a question pretty much every church has to deal with at some point. And believe me, the answer is way more complicated than you probably think.
Yeah, this is not your typical job search. We're not talking about corporate headhunters and a quick 2-week hiring process. No way. This is a sacred, year-long quest, and it's all handled by a small group of dedicated volunteers. They pour a massive part of their lives into this, and the stakes, they're incredibly high.
Okay, so the search begins. The second a pastor announces they're leaving, a very formal process just kicks right into gear. It's usually guided by a bigger regional church body. And the very first thing they have to do, put together the team that's going to lead this whole thing.
So let's meet the key players. These are the heroes of our story, really. They're called the Pastor Nominating Committee, or PNC for short. And you got to understand, this isn't some board of executives. These are just regular folks from the congregation, but they've been elected to take on this massive responsibility for everybody.
And who gets to be on this committee? The rules are actually pretty fascinating. They want this team to be like a mini version of the whole congregation, a mix of ages, genders, different backgrounds. But see that last point? Absolute confidentiality. That one is a huge deal. It's not just a suggestion. It is the foundation of the whole search.
And what's really wild is that even picking how you form the committee is a whole process in itself. The entire church gets to vote on one of 4 different methods. Each one has its pros and cons. You could have the church's board, the session, just nominate people, which is common in smaller churches, or you could go all the way to nominations from the floor, which is pretty rare because, well, it can get messy and not really represent everyone.
All right, so the committee's been assembled. Now their real work, their sacred quest, can finally get started.
And this is not something they just make up as they go along. There is a very detailed roadmap for this whole quest. The first steps are all about getting their ducks in a row, setting up their own structure, figuring out a budget, and then starting that really deep, important work of defining who they are as a church and what they're looking for.
And get this, the time commitment is 1 to 2 years. Just let that sink in for a second. These are volunteers, right? They've got jobs, families, lives, and they're signing up for weekly meetings for potentially 2 years. It's a total marathon, and it just shows an incredible level of dedication.
And it's not cheap either. The church usually sets aside a pretty serious budget, about $15,000 on average. That money covers all the practical stuff, travel for the committee, flying candidates in for interviews. It really shows you how much weight this whole process carries. So how do they actually get the word out? Well, they create this really important document called the Ministry Information Form, or MIF. You can think of it as their mission map. It's kind of like a job description, but it's also a profile of their community and even a little bit of a love letter to their own church. This is the beacon they send out to attract the right people. So now they're defining the mission. But before they can even think about looking at candidates, the committee has to do some real soul searching. They have to sit down and answer that huge question. Who are we, really, and where are we headed?
Now for the candidate's story. The document they submit is called the Personal Information Form, or PIF. This is basically the pastor's version of a super detailed resume and a LinkedIn profile all rolled into one. It's got their whole biography, their theology, what they see as their strengths, everything.
And once that MIF goes live, the floodgates just open. The committee can get buried under hundreds of these PIFs. They come from everywhere, people applying on their own, suggestions from the congregation, even a denominational matching system. And their job is to go through every single one.
And all this time, secrecy is absolutely key. There's this great quote, "Loose lips sink ships." They've been known to sink a pastor nominating process too. And it's so true. If a name gets leaked, it could cause chaos at that person's current church or get people's hopes up for no reason. Confidentiality is there to protect everyone involved. Okay, so now begins the paper chase. With all those applications pouring in, the committee is now diving into what is honestly the most grueling part of their entire quest. It's just endless sifting, reading, and trying to discern who might be a good fit.
The best way to think about this part is like a giant funnel. They start with this huge pile of hundreds of PIFs at the top. Then, through careful screening, reference checks, and a whole lot of discussion, they slowly narrow it down, and down, and down. until they're left with a short list of maybe 3 to 6 top candidates. All right, things are about to get real. The paper chase is over. It's finally time to meet the finalists. The committee gets to see the actual people behind all that paperwork. And this leads to one of the most fascinating and, frankly, kind of sneaky parts of the whole process, the neutral pulpit. It's basically a secret sermon. The committee arranges for a final candidate to go preach at a totally different, uninvolved church nearby. This way, the committee can see them in action, but nobody at that church knows what's going on, and nobody at the candidate's home church knows they're even looking. It's an incredible move to keep everything confidential.
Then comes the interview weekend, and this is a big deal. The candidate, and often their spouse, are flown in for a whole weekend. The committee really rolls out the red carpet, showing them the church, the town, everything. There are formal interviews, sure, but a lot of it is about seeing if the vibe is right. And remember, the committee isn't just interviewing, they're also being interviewed. They have to sell their church too. And all of this is still happening in total secrecy.
So, after all that work, sometimes years of it, the committee makes the call. They've found the one. They believe this is their person. But, hold on. The quest isn't over just yet. There's still a few final steps.
Yeah, see, the PNC's decision is technically a nomination. It's not the final word. Their choice has to go through this whole series of approvals from different groups. It's a system of checks and balances, really, to make sure such an important decision is sound.
And this is what that final chain of approval looks like. It's basically 4 big steps. First, the candidate has to accept the PNC's offer. Then, a regional committee interviews and approves them. Then, for the first time, the candidate is introduced to the whole congregation, who gets to vote. And if that passes, the whole regional body, the presbytery, gives the final official approval. It's like a 3-way handshake between the pastor, the congregation, and the larger church.
And with that, the quest is finally over. I mean, think about it. A year, maybe 2, of intense, detailed, responsible work, all done by volunteers. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does a process this careful, this intricate, tell us about how much a community truly values its leadership?